Ready? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our three-part series. This is the second in the third series event of Transform for Tomorrow and the Pitt Ed Justice Collective. It's a collaboration between the Allegheny Intermediate Unit 3, the University of Pittsburgh, and Remake Learning. We welcome you and our guests to this session. Today, we have Dr. Valerie Kinlock, who will be moderating the session for us. Dr. Kinlock is from the University of Pittsburgh and the Dean of the School of Education. We have Dr. Rhianna Roby, Michelle Cody, Dr. Carrie Coca, and we have members of the Allegheny Intermediate Unit 3, Kevin Connor, who is helping to man this technologically, whose expertise we could not have done without. We thank you, Kevin, and also Dr. Megan Calais. If you have any questions regarding the Act 45 requirements, Act 45 for those from Pennsylvania, if you're doing that, it is due by September 30th, and Dr. Calais will be happy to answer those questions. This session is being recorded. We do have a bit.ly link for questions and also for participants so that you can review present and past resources. Today is an opportunity for us to share and learn from one another, and this most certainly would not be possible without the support of Greg Bear and the Grable Foundation. We are indebted to the foundation for all they are doing for the region. At this time, I'd like to share the conversation with Dr. Rocco. Dr. Rocco?
Thanks, Dr. Rondinelli, appreciate it. You know, I don't want to waste any time because we have what I would call an all-star team on board today from across the country. So, and we're used to doing these sessions in the morning, so we have to do it in the afternoon today because we have some folks on the West Coast and we don't want to get too early. So, but you know, it is really my distinct pleasure to turn our program over to, again, who I call a friend, a colleague, and just a leader in the field on social justice in this country. And I call her a friend, but also a colleague, and that's Dr. Valerie Kinlock. Dr. Kinlock, I'll let you take over because we have a lot to cover, and an hour goes very quickly, as we know from the last session. So, Dr. Kinlock.
All right, thank you, Bart and Billy. So let me actually just welcome everyone to our second session in this series on justice, equity, and anti-racism. And please bear with me. I want to introduce our three panelists because they accepted the invitation without question, without probably knowing what I was going to ask them to talk about today. And they came and they actually met this challenge for me. So I want to start by introducing Michelle Cody. Michelle Cody is a middle school mathematics teacher at Willie L. Brown Jr. Middle School in San Francisco, California. I am happy to say that she is a proud graduate of Howard University, a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. I'm from Johnson C. Smith University, Michelle, in North Carolina, so we should have some conversations. And she completed her master's work in urban education and social justice from the University of San Francisco. Her overall goal is to decolonize mathematics and support Black, Brown, and Indigenous liberation through mathematics mastery. She is currently creating social justice mathematics lessons that engage students socially and mathematically. And she hopes one day to publish her work so that it becomes widely available to everyone who's invested in transformative justice work. And let me also end with saying that she is the proud mother of an 11-year-old kid and the daughter of very supportive parents. So Michelle Cody, thank you for being with us. And I'm hoping to be able to recruit you to the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, but we'll talk about that later, Michelle. Let me introduce Carrie Coca. Carrie Coca is an amazing assistant professor of mathematics education in our School of Education here at the University of Pittsburgh. Carrie studies student and teacher perspectives of social justice mathematics, STEM teacher activism, student engagement, and mathematics classrooms. She has been an educator for the past 21 years, and her most influential teaching experiences were learned during her 10 years as a mathematics teacher organizer and an instructional coach at Vanguard High School. And Vanguard is a Title I public school in New York City and part of the Coalition of Essential Schools and her work with the New York Performance Standards Consortium. Carrie is co-founder of the Creating Balance in an Unjust World Conference and STEAM with 2 M's, Education and Social Justice. She is also former co-chair of the Critical Educators for Social Justice, SIG, and has been part of the radical STEAM educators of the Bay Area, People's Education Movement, and the New York Collective of Radical Educators. Carrie, it is a pleasure to have you as a colleague in our School of Education here at the University of Pittsburgh. And so thank you for joining us today. And finally, let me introduce Rihanna S. Roby, Soror. Rihanna is a postdoctoral scholar at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College in the Department of Teaching and Learning. She currently works with the NSF-funded Fisk Vanderbilt Bridge Program Regional Center of Excellence in broadening participation. As a first-generation scholar, her background as a Black Southern woman in science informs her service, her research, and her teaching and praxis. Her scholarship employs critical race feminism, curriculum theory, and critical qualitative methodologies to explore the ways in which the narratives of Black women and girls in science, whether we call it formal or informal, could be used to reconceptualize science. I wanted to spend time introducing our three panelists, Michelle, Carrie, and Rihanna, because we're going to have a really interesting conversation about justice and anti-racism when we think about STEM. And so I want to get started. I want to jump in because the hour goes so quickly. And this session is different from the very first one we had. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk with each other about STEM, about mathematics and science education, about transformative pedagogies, and about the work that these three amazing people do. And so I want to just jump in and start with this first question. So how are you? How are you? And when I say how are you as a person doing at this very moment, as we are living within two pandemics, a health pandemic and a racism pandemic? How are you doing? And how do you see your work as central to your well-being and the well-being of others? And I'm going to start with Dr. Carrie Coca.
Okay, that's such a good question because I think that I don't think about that question. And I want to think about soon to be Dr. Cody's classroom and thinking about the trauma-informed work that she does. And one of my good friends, Dr. Farima Khorshid, often reminds me that workaholism can be a trauma response. So that is something that I think I'm still thinking about quite a bit.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Rihanna.
So thank you for the question. It's such a real question, right? And I'm going to attempt to answer it as genuinely as I can, because I could sit here like, oh, I'm fine, I'm good. But the reality is, the fact of the matter is I'm making it day by day, right? And as in that making it day by day, some days are better than others, some hours are better than others. In this moment, I'm excited to be able to share a little bit around how at least my envisioning and living as a scientist, embodying science, allows for me to be hopeful and to see things a little differently. But I acknowledge, as you mentioned, we are living in two pandemics, really experiencing two pandemics at the same time, which feels a little bit different than like the day-to-day experiencing your misogynoir and things of that nature. But I'm making it and I'm excited to be here because this is gonna be a bright spot for the day. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And Miss Michelle.
I don't know, like I feel what Rihanna's saying, like this is, as far as like the second pandemic, this racial pandemic, I feel like I've been living this racial pandemic all my life. So it's like I'm not new to this, I'm true to this. I think on top of that, having this health pandemic, like exacerbated by this shelter in place, right? This like being confined inside of like your own living quarters allows for either a lot of self-reflection or a lot of denial, right? You either can take those two roads. And so I think that currently, like I'm a little overwhelmed because I have been like doing this work, and I see like all these people like, oh, I'm down. And I'm like, they haven't done the work. So I'm trying to figure out how I can stay in my lane and stay true to like my own self, like, and not become overwhelmed by it all, because this can be very overwhelming, right? You want to engage with people, you want to support people, but I remember like when you're on the plane, you got to put your mask on first, right? And so making sure that I'm doing what I can to keep myself healthy, and that's not always what I'm doing, and it's something that I have to actively think about, like, what am I doing to take care of myself? What am I doing to take care of my kid? What am I doing to like create community within inside of my family, inside of our space? So those are all the things I'm trying to do, and try to do the work at the same time. So it is that juggling act that if you're a parent out there, you know what I'm talking about. So it's like this whole parent juggling act exacerbated by all the other things that are happening in the world.
Thank you for starting there. Thank you all for starting there. Because I think that oftentimes we jump into conversations and we don't take a moment to think about how we are in relation to other people. And so, you know, we could say that we're well, and I would say, are we really? And when we talk about being well or being whole, what does that mean? As Michelle, you just said, in terms of always having lived in a race, in this racism pandemic, you know? And so what does that even mean? You also just said something about learning how to stay in your lane. And so for the purposes of this conversation, I want to not stay in lanes. And I want us to be able to cross lanes. I want us to be able to talk about the work in relation to practice and praxis. And I want us to be okay saying, I don't have a lane, because we are redefining these boundaries that tend to say we have to be in this particular way of life. And with that question, I want to jump into what you all might see as your current lane that you're crossing and moving out of, and that is STEM. And I would say from the work that you all do, that's thinking about critical STEM education, particularly for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples. And so can we actually start with you helping us to understand what is social justice mathematics, or what is social justice science? Because when I read your work, I see the reference made to social justice mathematics education and social justice science education. What exactly is that? Can you help all of us sort of think through what that means?
So I don't mind starting there. And I think if I can play with your question a little bit and think about what, and then imagine what does it mean to have or imagine just science or justice-oriented science. And for me, because my background is in science and I'm interested or invested in the narratives of Black women in science, part of that looks like, what does it mean to decenter whiteness in science? And by doing that, what does it mean for us to acknowledge there are multiple ways of knowing and engaging in science? And historically, some of those ways have been privileged or given a platform, and while others have been diminished. And so I'm always thinking about, how is it that my grandmother, in her practice of doing science, whether it was to keep her home or to support the community, how is that science just as valuable as the science that we learn about, but as well as how is that science looking to, I think, be more inclusive? How does that science look to be disruptive? And how does that science, the science that she engaged in her homemaking, how does it give us a way to speak truth to power and really think about who can be a scientist and who gets to author science?
Can I jump in real quick?
Please.
This is a conversation, right? So Rihanna, I actually just did a presentation at the Creating Balance Conference, and it was called My Mom, the Mathematician. And the whole purpose of that was to talk about how, like, we need to get away from, like, this very cisgender identity around white male cisgender identity about who's a mathematician, right? Because it's the simple things of, like, when I'm going to the grocery store and I'm trying to feed my family and I'm trying to make that money stretch, that's math and it's practice, right? And that right there is transformative, and we don't elevate that. We don't elevate that. There's examples that families are doing every day that shows that they are math geniuses. I first started my career as a math and science teacher And I was talking to my group of kids, and I was like, you know how we always talk about these mathematicians in history? And I was like, there's such an economic privilege, because a lot of them, like if you're a monk and you don't have to have a job, of course you can sit there and look at peas all day and observe them, because you don't have no responsibilities. There's nothing that you have to do but just like observe things. And so there's that privilege in that. And so like, it's not to say that there wasn't transformative sciences that were happening all throughout history, but there's that economic privilege that plays into who gets to have the time to like do scientific things without the pressure of other things that are happening in our lives. And I want to like segue into like what I see as social justice mathematics. I want to say that one of the first things I want to make sure is that the students are understanding the math concepts, right? Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to create this world where people are feeling bad for our students and they just want to talk about touchy-feely stuff. And then a kid goes a whole year and doesn't get any of the academics that they need, right? Because that right there is a disservice that they're doing to our students. And so I always make sure that I base it on the math. Like, what is the math concepts? What are the math principles that I'm trying to get my students to understand? And then I try to introduce them to real world issues that they can get into, because there's some kids who are just jazzed about the math, right? Like, I like math, I'm getting in there because I'm jazzed about the math. There's other students who are like, I could care less about the math. And so there has to be another hook. And that's my job as a teacher, is to create multiple entry points so that everybody can get in there, so they're all doing the work. And so it was actually because of Carrie coming to my class for her dissertation work that I really had to like elevate my like social justice math like lens and my practice. And I got, it was between her and my coach, like really just hammering down, like, how can we make this accessible? And then once I saw the kids engage, I got hooked. I was like, oh my goodness, we have to do more, because they're so excited about it. And like, my babies actually that spring semester presented their work at the University of San Francisco at one of the symposiums. And here it was like 5 6th graders talking about social justice math and running the project. And it was just like so overwhelming, because I'm just sitting there like, I'm just their ride, y'all. I'm just driving them. That was my whole purpose. And they did all the work and they were excited and they were just telling people, which makes you know that like, if presented correctly, students can get excited about this stuff, right? They can make that transition. And then not only make that transition, this can get them to start like a movement. Like, if I don't like something that's happening in my neighborhood, I have the math, the facts, the statistics to tell you you're doing this wrong. And now I want you to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I will add is to reiterate the importance of rigor that Michelle mentioned, right? That rigor is so important. And that a lot of times the best thing for adults to do is to get out of the way of the kids doing the work. You know, if we think about the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, they were high school and college students. I really encourage folks to watch the recording of the QCEF youth panel that happened a couple of weeks ago. It's like mic drop, you know, like we can just play their video over again when it's supposed to be the adults, right? So I think that empowering students, I would say, as well as teachers. So I know that this series has had a lot of school leaders on the call in the past. And one of the things that my principal, Luis Delgado, did when I was teaching in New York City was he allowed me to bring my students to protests and rallies. And I would tell him, I mean, we had parental consent and all of that. And it was because we had these strong relationships with parents. And I would tell him, you know, Luis, there's a possibility that we might get arrested. And he would say, no, I'm going to think positively. I think it's going to be okay. And so I was very fortunate in that sense, but I had an administrator who was willing to support that work that Mr. Henderson said on Tuesday as an agitator. I definitely see myself as an agitator in that sense.
So let's actually go there. So I've heard the word agitation, agitator. I've heard disruption. And then I also heard you talk about, some of you saying, you know, having multiple entry points. So when we think about STEM, when we're thinking about particularly math education, science education from this critical perspective, like what does it mean for teachers and school leaders to support that type of agitation and disruption? Walk me into a scene. Like, what does it look like for students to be able to transform and agitate and disrupt in STEM? Or what does it mean for teachers to be able to do that work?
So I'll speak on a couple of points. So I'll speak on one, what it looked like for me as a science educator within a makerspace, what that looked like. And then thinking about from like the perspective of my students who I've co-authored work with, and what that meant. So like for me as somebody who had like bench science experience, and thinking like this is the way that science happens, even though I knew all the informal ways because I had a cosmetologist who was doing my hair who was engaging in science, right? So part of it looked like me stepping back and being reflective around how did the science that I was learning in the classroom, where were the tensions between the science that I was learning and the tensions between the science that I was living? And I think it's a tricky space to get into because it means then thinking about, so if this is the scientific method and this is how we've been teaching the scientific method, how have folks been doing this in their everyday life without calling it the scientific method? And does that make it less valid science because they haven't called it that? What does it mean if they author it differently? And so this gets back into like, how do we author science? And so I think about the youth who I used to work with in a makerspace who day after day took me to the back because I have my fabulous ideas that I think are amazing and grand, and they come with some like, that's kind of trash, but we gonna do it this way. And I gave them space to do that. Like I allowed them to, like I didn't give them the power to do it because they had the power to do it, but I gave them the space to do it. So part of this is like how do we like negotiate our own big ideas and our own conceptions around who has power and who can author, and see that youth have agency, you have power, you have brilliant conceptions around science that blow our minds in ways that we can't quite, in ways that maybe we've gotten away from because we've been playing school or we've been playing in the system for so long, right? So I think I'm always talking about with my friends around what does it mean to reimagine science and what does it mean to get to a space where we were our former child selves, where imagination was something that we could go into freely. And I feel like the work that I was able to do then, like in the maker spaces, particularly maker spaces and community centers, had room for that.
Yeah, I think in mathematics, because it is such a standardized tested subject, right? And so who are the people who get to make those standards? Who are the people who make those standardized assessments, right? Who are the people that make the decisions around admissions for college, right? And so when we think about this reimagining, right, it's hard for us to think about. Actually, Michelle, in your session at Creating Balance, actually Rihanna also presented at Creating Balance, you asked us to try to decolonize our mind and think outside of school mathematics. And it was so hard for all of us because we have been so conditioned to think, well, this is one type of math or this is one type of science, and this is the authentic one that the dominant folks claim as the authentic space. And so I think that part is really important to think about. And then going back to the question about entry points, so social justice math really aligns with the dominant research in math education. So in math education, a lot of Joe Bowler's work is around kids having multiple entry points into the mathematics. So whether that be you are working in a small group or you're working in a partner, you're working with manipulatives, you're presenting on the board, maybe with a document camera. In my time, it was an overhead projector. And so it is another way to connect students to the content to get them hooked into the mathematics.
I think that I'm very privileged because I work at a school that I've been there longer than my principal. And so no one really bothers me. And I work at a predominantly Black and brown school, and there's a lot of liberty that go around Black and brown schools. But recently my school has become a little bit more integrated, meaning there's like more white kids coming in to the space. And so it is a little tricky now, right? Because the freedom in the language I was able to use before, right? I'm like, I need to use that same language towards these students because I need them to hear this work, right? And so for me, it's just about the math is there. The math concepts are there. So if someone's parent walks in the door and says, why are you talking about food deserts? Why are you talking about misogynist noir and like how Black women are being like attacked on the media? I'm like, oh no, don't worry about it. We're actually talking about, we're actually talking about absolute value. We're actually talking about moving across the number line. And I have 6th grade math, right? And so I'm their foundation into algebra. So everything that I'm trying to teach them now is something that they're going to be able to use all the way into 12th grade. So it's important that the concepts stick, but the concepts will only stick if the content is relevant, right? Because we have learned so much stuff in our lives that if somebody were to ask you, I mean, how many times have you taught something to a student and the next year you're like, did you learn this? And they're like, no. You're like, no, we did. We spent like 4 weeks on this. Like I was there, you were there, we were sitting in the classroom, and they're like, nah, sorry. And that's because the content did not stick. They didn't make a connection. And studies have shown that in order for you to learn something, it has to make an connection to your prior knowledge. And so by engaging the students in these radical conversations about travesties that are happening inside their community or that they're seeing inside the world, and then adding that math to it, allows it to stick. And it allows them to be able to be like, you know what, this is important and I'm gonna use this later on in life. I know that a lot of people are like, oh, math is ridiculous after like adding and subtracting because I don't really need it. And that's because we've created this society that says only certain people have the luxury to like think mathematically. And I think that if we really just want students to believe that they're mathematicians, because I tell my babies all the time, listen, some of y'all are not gonna go into math and that's fine, but I don't want math to tell you that you don't deserve to be in math. I want you to say, I don't want to do it. And I feel like that's a different thing. And so I think the idea that everybody has the right to become a doctor, everybody has a right to become somebody who authors a paper about mathematics is something that I feel like is a fundamental educational right. Like I'm in this work to make sure that my babies know that they deserve it all. And if they don't believe that they deserve it all, then I've done something wrong in my practice.
So Michelle, I want you to go there for a minute. You're in this work to make sure that our babies get the work, that they are engaged, that they're cared for, that they know that they're geniuses. What about the folks who we know aren't in the work for those reasons and that they engage in oppressive practices in our classrooms? Like, how do we push back against them and their practices of oppression when it comes to thinking about Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other peoples of color who they believe might not be mathematically or even scientifically inclined? What do we do?
So that's a good question, because I just finished a couple months ago reading Dr. Bettina's Love book. And I was like, you know what? I'm about this abolition teaching life. And I'm not going to allow people who, because let's be really honest, people who don't think that they need to do the work are in, I love how all y'all got that book, right? That's what's up. I like people who don't believe that students need to do the work normally find themselves in Black and brown communities. Like, let's be honest. Like, if you go into, if you see the trash teachers, they're normally working in Black and brown communities because they don't feel like they have to push their thinking. They don't feel, and that's this whole other system, right? It's a system of like Black, Indigenous folks, families not being given the opportunity to call their schools out and call their teachers out, right? While other communities have that privilege to do that. And so that's why you don't see shenanigans happening in other communities. But we have to call people out on their stuff. Like the day I became tenure, I told my principal, oh baby, it's over now. because now I'm telling all of my feelings. I'm letting everyone know what's happening. And it's not like, it's not about me not liking you as a person. It's about you are doing harm to my students. You are doing harm to where they see themselves. If you are giving referrals after referrals after referrals to students, let's not check the students, let's check you. Like, what's happening in your classroom that you feel that you need to write 150 referrals in a semester? That right there is problematic and toxic. If you see that your students are coming to your class late every day, that's a reflection of what's going on in your classroom. Why are they coming to your class every day late? That's because something's wrong with your practice. And I think that we're in a situation where we need teachers. And so we'll take whoever we can get, right? Like, okay, well, I'll just take this because this is all I can get. But that's not okay. Like, if we want students to see themselves as amazing, transformative, like students, people, human beings, whatever, we have the people who are supporting their educational journey to also believe that. And if you don't believe that, then by the door, you can get a job making more money somewhere else and not do as much harm. And that's the thing. You're doing harm, and that's not okay.
Can I jump in on that?
Please do. Please go for it.
So I have something to say about teacher education, but first I wanted to offer a structure that we used at my school. It was part of the Coalition of Essential Schools based on Debbie Meyer and Ted Sizer's work. And so we had an advisory program where we had our same kids for their whole 4-year college career, right? And so if I had 4 seniors graduate, I had 4 first years come in with me. And those are my babies, right? I have obviously an identity crisis because I talk in the present tense, like I still work at my school. And if something happened with another teacher and I needed to call in that teacher and to question what that teacher said to my student, I would have that conversation, right? Because those are my babies. Like, I'm mama bear, like I'm gonna handle that situation. And vice versa, if something, maybe my student was upset about something or had something going on at home and said something that they shouldn't have, right? I facilitated that conversation as the advisor. But I think that it really helped to keep all of the staff accountable because we knew what happened in everybody's room. There was no such thing as on-campus suspension. If someone was asked to leave the class, they would just come to my advisees would come to me and I would have that conversation. So I just wanted to offer like a structural piece for those folks who are thinking about school structures that support that type of accountability. And then, to Michelle's point, I think that, teacher education, the fact that it oftentimes is a 1-year program, I think is really difficult. And I think, like you said, Michelle, the fact that we are always looking for math and science teachers and the fact that people with technical degrees can make more money doing other things than teaching. So I do think that it's harder to recruit teachers, but I do think that it is a grave responsibility of teacher education, not only to educate those that we admit, but also to really think about students when we go through our admissions process, to think about, is this someone who we see as being a strong educator for all students?
Brianna, do you want to add into this?
I was trying to jump in my mind in multiple ways. I was like, okay, let me sit back. Right. For real, I think a few different things as I think about how then do we call in folks who are doing damaging work, who are damaging. And I can say for the most part, I have not yet had that experience, and that's not one that I think I wish to have as where like I'm teaching, but I know I saw it as a student, right? And I know how it made me feel and how it killed parts of my spirit, right? To be on the other side of teaching practices that did not see me, right? And when I say they didn't see me, they didn't see me as human. So they saw me maybe as less than. And so I'm trying to think about how then do we create in spaces and environments for that? At this point in life, right, where I'm at now, I have no problem calling out And I think especially like within teacher ed, one of the things that I would do with like my teachers, my students who are pre-service teachers is like, think about like how politically charged teaching is, and like that this is not a neutral space. And so in the moment that you think that you are on neutral ground, you're probably doing harm to somebody. And that somebody is probably somebody like me, or somebody who has not always had the privilege of being centered in the narrative or centered in teaching practices. And so I say that again because just last year I was giving a talk at UT, and someone's like, well, how do you have room to do decentral whiteness in STEM? Like when the curriculum is already set. I was like, well, the curriculum is set, but you get to select different texts. You can bring in current issues that help your students attach like these principles to like real life. Michelle brought up misogyny specifically, and then talked about using a math problem without content. Even me and one of my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, Eric, were talking about what does it mean to learn about logarithmic and exponent work, and then to be living in a COVID world where we think about the spread growing exponentially. Like that is your everyday middle school, high school math problem in real life. So then how does it, then we even think about getting back to the point around doing some of the disruption for the folks who might be in denial that something like this could be real. In this point, the math isn't lying to you. Like the history is on our side. And I think about Dr. Love, and I love that we all had our book, Dr. Love talking about at the end, we gonna win, because the history and the work that we are doing and being abolitionists in our teaching practices and our research is for those who have not always been able to speak on their behalf. So that's just that's it. I'm gonna leave it there.
Whew. All right. You don't have to leave it there because you all went there, and you all went there for very important reasons. There's so many things I want to say, but I want to jump to some of the comments and questions. And so someone said yes to accountability. Someone says that I think the biggest issue is that educators don't know our kids enough to connect the content with who our kids are. Someone wrote, disrupting a colonialist curriculum, where diverse ways of knowing are reduced to these rote information and white-centered literature. And I think that you talked about all of these things. Inside of our question and answer, there is someone who actually said, Audre Lorde said, and this person quotes, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, end of quote. So I want to go to this question in light of that reality. This person wants to know, given the Eurocentric and white nature of math and science, and we're not just talking content and pedagogy, but the idea of math and science, how do you envision social justice math and or social justice science as challenging racism? Can social justice math, social justice science challenge racism? Is that even possible?
Absolutely.
And I'm going to turn it over to you all. Go, Dr. Rihanna.
I will say absolutely, and I have two things, right? I think about myself being a bridge, right? I came over from, my background is in chemistry. I was at the bench before I was doing social science research around science and education. And one of the questions that I was that I still ask is like, how do we have a diverse science without diverse epistemologies of science? Because what we know is that diverse ways of knowing and doing science call to the rug how scientific practices have been dehumanizing. They have worked to exploit Black women's bodies and brown women's bodies for the advancement of a field. So I think part of that, so that's one thing, is like getting into thinking about the epistemologies that aren't necessarily centered. The other piece is like in our makerspace, one of my babies, and I will call her Nyla in this space, used her skills as a science and as an engineer and everything to create this little, this board called Stop Racism, hashtag Stop Racism. Because once she saw the power in what hashtags could do and how to get a conversation going, she saw the power in her, using her voice and pulling the narratives and the stories from her peers to say, hey, I'm one person, but if you can see this light up sign, then maybe they will call you to have another conversation around how we're thinking about racism. And so I think, so absolutely, we can use science and mathematics, but not in the historical traditional ways that we've been doing them, right? Because the historic traditional ways in which we've been doing them and that we've been teaching them have only did work to perpetuate harm, right? To reify this idea that, oh, well, science is objective, mathematics is objective, and we know at the end of the day that they're not. And if that's the case, how then do we get into spaces where we are, I don't even say comfortable, but get comfortable being uncomfortable with uprooting some of the toxicity and some of the whiteness that has been used to make folks be read as inhuman or dehuman?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's also a time issue. And Dr. Rochelle Gutierrez talked about playing the game to change the game. But it also means that, I mean, even for instance, in academia, right? As a critical scholar, I need to know the dominant literature and I know the critical literature, right? I can't just know my own expertise like folks who do dominant work can. And so I think, like Michelle and I were talking about rigor, we are referring to rigor, or I think, Michelle, in the sense of the standards as they currently sit, right? Because for me, when I was teaching in New York City, that's what my students were going to be evaluated on. And I knew that I needed to prepare my students for the current situation, even though, yes, we reimagined something completely different. And one of the things that my school did was we actually restructured the school day so they had a double block of math for their whole 4 years. So they essentially had 8 years worth of mathematics, even though the state requirement was 3. And so doing that did allow us the time in order to use more equitable pedagogical practices, have students do performance assessments and complex instruction, and think about social issues.
So even though I'm the only, my work is very classroom based because that's where I am in my life right now. I'm a classroom teacher. And so I have examples of like this actually happening. And so, like I said, Carrie came into my classroom and was like, I want to study your classroom. And she helped really push my thinking around this and the urgency. And I remember specifically, I was sitting down with my coach looking at this math lesson around hot air balloons. And the whole purpose was talking about moving across zero. And like what that looks like. And so I'm sitting with my coach and I'm like, where's a hot air balloon starting? Are we on the ground? Are we on a mountain? Are we in the sky? Like what's happening? And I got so frustrated and I'm like, I'm a world traveler. Like I'm highly educated and I couldn't get past like what is happening with the hot air balloon because I'm a city girl and I've never been inside of a hot air balloon. Right. And so I'm like, we have these math lessons that are so abstract and they're just like content that students can't even get past what you're asking them to do mathematically because they don't understand the situation. And so I took that specific lesson and I turned it into the train, and everyone has like some sort of like public transportation. Most cities have a train that goes, you know what I'm saying, like back and forth. So I took it to the train that's actually in the neighborhood of where we are. And I was like, okay, let's elevate this. And so we started talking, and it's called Aquila, and oh God, it's a food desert one. So it's about this girl named Aquila who has a grandma who's turning 70, and she wants to make her grandma gumbo because her grandma's from Louisiana, and so she needs to get fresh ingredients. But Aquila lives in a neighborhood that doesn't have fresh ingredients. So she gets on the train and she has to travel 36 blocks north to go to Safeway, 42 blocks south to go to like this Pack and Save. And so we talk about like all the traveling that she's doing. So again, here's the math going across the number line, positive and negative. And then we talk about food deserts. And so we started having this conversation about like, okay, what kind of stores are in your neighborhood? Are they mostly corner stores or are they grocery stores? And so then students were able to talk about, wait a minute, like, you're right. Like we always have to like get in a car or on a bus or on a train to get access to fresh groceries and fresh food. And so then that conversation about food deserts happened, right? So now we're talking about like, why is it that there's no grocery stores in your neighborhood, right? Now, this is a 6th grade lesson. At the same time, I'm working with a 1st grade teacher who's in Bayview, who's also in the same neighborhood. And I'm doing that exact same lesson with them, and we're doing it this year. And I'm having them count, we're gonna look at a big map, and we're gonna ask them, what's your favorite thing to eat? Like, if you had a party, what's your favorite thing that you wanna make? So the kids will talk about what their favorite thing to make, and then she's gonna present her favorite recipe, right, for a dish. And they're like, okay, so where do we get this kind of food? Can we get this at the corner store? And the kids are like, oh no, we need to go to the grocery store. And then they're gonna look at a map, and the kids are gonna count. We're doing a map right now of the neighborhood. The kids are gonna count how many grocery stores are in their neighborhood and how many corner stores in the neighborhood. And in 1st grade, they're gonna make the connection that there are so many more corner stores in their neighborhood versus grocery stores. So for people to be like, social justice math can't happen on all different levels, it's ridiculous, because now they're gonna be like, wait a minute. And no, they're not gonna be able to like,
Is Michelle frozen?
a 1st grade letter, I'm like, there's a lot of stores in here. Why is there a lot of stores in here? We need grocery stores. And so like, that's what I'm talking about. Like being able to use the math and use social issues to help students make connections and realize that they deserve better. And you know what? Students can do so many things because of the internet, so many things because of social media. They can make so many changes. And so I think that getting away from this idea that that only the adults can make the difference, I think that giving them the key, and I'm not telling them the answer, I'm just giving them the resources. This is what it is. You make that connection. You make that difference. And having that same conversation, not just in Black and Brown communities, because I had a colleague who did that same Akila lesson in a very affluent middle school in San Francisco. And the kids were like dumbfounded. They're like, wait a minute. You mean there's neighborhood with like, there's food deserts? There's neighborhoods that don't have access to grocery stores? Like, are you kidding me? And I'm like, no, yeah, they don't. And so like the fact that now we have the elevation of both like students of affluence and students of like content coming together, that's where we're gonna see the radical change happening, right? And all I get to do is step back, and if somebody asks me, I'm like, it's the standard 6.2.147, check it out. That's all we're doing, standards.
Can I add to something else that you did in your class, Michelle? So another thing that you did, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, is you use a lot of trauma-informed care and radical healing practices. And you asked students how they felt about what they were learning in their community. You had them identify their emotions and process their emotions. One of your students in particular that you and I just talked about last week, in my interview with him, shared about his family experiencing housing insecurity, right? And we were able to, I asked him, can I tell Ms. Cody, can we connect you to a counselor? So I think that it's important to think about the racialized trauma of this work. When I think about anti-racism, I often think about like, whose labor is this to do? And in which communities should I be doing this work, right? And so I don't think that it is fair to ask folks of color to be re-traumatized to work with dominant folks, white folks. So that's something that I think about quite a bit. And I also agree with you that it's super important to think about what are white students learning about, right? And so another teacher that I studied was teaching predominantly white students in an independent school with affluent kids. And she was really working on building their empathy. And I think Nicole Mira's work around critical civic empathy, I think is really powerful. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that I think that ethnic studies is something else for us to really think about, because it is so important for us to know about our own histories that Dr. Roby talked about, that Michelle talked about. And I think that for white people, I think that it's hard, it's like an academic endeavor for them to think about the importance of race. Like I watched the, actually I only watched one episode so far of the PBS series on Asian Americans. And, you know, I have my own books that I've been trying to learn about my own Japanese American history. And I just cried at the end because, you know, like race is such an important part of our identities. That should never be ignored, or you're going to leave that at the door when you come into math class, or that's not something that matters in this space. And so I've just been thinking about that a lot in terms of our commitment to anti-racism is in your everyday life, in your everyday actions with all people that you interact with.
Well, I want to jump in here really quickly because I know we have 10 minutes and there's like another 5 hours of conversation that we just should have. But I want to turn to some of the things that you've written about, all of you. And I'm going to start with just this passage. I'm going to read this to you, and it comes from an article authored by you, Carrie Coca, and it's titled Healing Informed Social Justice Mathematics. And I want to offer this, and I want us to possibly think about some of the things that you've said already, all of you said. You do this work brilliantly inside of schools, inside of museums, maker spaces. You all are on the front lines when it comes to thinking about critical social justice-based mathematics education and science education. And then we talk about our kids. We talk about the young folks who walk into our classrooms. And then at the end of your article, Carrie, this is what you write. You say that this study and its healing-informed social justice mathematics approach, combining social justice math, radical healing, trauma-informed care, may offer a way to support students' well-being and development of socio-political consciousness in mathematics classrooms. Mathematics teachers can engage in this work by contextualizing mathematics problems with local social concerns and asking students about their feelings associated with such issues. And that is exactly what Michelle just described in terms of thinking about neighborhoods, thinking about food deserts, thinking about access to. And I wonder if you can just talk with me, talk with all of us about the idea that we need to engage in a healing-informed social justice approach to mathematics, and Rihanna, also to science. How do we even begin this? And I'm thinking about school leaders. I'm thinking about principals and superintendents and teachers who are gearing up to go back to school in some kind of different format. How do we talk about the healing and the care that we oftentimes ignore when we have students walking into our classrooms or online being taught? How do we even do this? Michelle, Carrie, Rihanna?
I think, Michelle, you should go first.
Well, I think that I actually when Carrie was doing work at UC Berkeley, I got an opportunity to sit in or present to her class, and one of the resources that people always ask me is like, how do they create their own social justice lessons? And so I created like a treatment plan to help people get into this work. Because I, as amazing as I am, can't produce everything for everyone, right? And so like people need to be able to do this on their own. So I think that one of the ways is like, we need to talk about this stuff. Like, I think that you need to look at the data at your school. Look at how your Black and Brown and Indigenous folks are performing in mathematics. And instead of accusing them of not being successful, let's look at how you're going about the practice. And I think that's extremely important. I think that for the longest time, education has blamed students for their lack of movement instead of reevaluating the practice. And let's also get really, let's understand the idea that we're normalizing things that are not normal to other cultures except for white cultures, right? I was in a AV math and anti-racist group last night, and they were like, we don't use the word norms anymore because norms are associated with like white dominant culture. Like when you say norms in the classroom, don't talk over each other. Like if you've been to most people of color's house, People are always talking over each other. And it's not disrespectful. It's because we're engaging in discourse at such a heightened level that everyone's excited. The level of excitement is there. I mean, like, that's one of my issues with Zoom classes, because it's like, I'm looking in the abyss and I'm like, I need people to be talking over each other. Like, that kind of like discourse gets kids to like, I hear, I'm moving, I'm excited, that level of excitement. Because when I see arguing in a classroom, I'm like, oh, I feel so passionately about this subject that I want to now express my opinion. And I feel like that's progress, right? I also think that that leaders have to really do their own self-reflection. Like, where do they stand? What do they know? What resources do they have? Who are their homies? Like, if you're listening to the same people that have your same experiences, baby, you ain't learning nothing. Like, you can't learn about something else unless you step outside of your comfort zone. Like, the fact that I'm on this panel, and I'll say this one more time, like, I'm on this panel with like doctors, this is outside of my comfort zone. Like, I hang with teachers, I roll with educators, right? But I have something to say, and it's okay for me to voice my opinion. And no, I haven't wrote anything academic, but I'm on the front line, I'm doing the work, right? So I know what my students need, and I know how I can best support my students. I also think that we also need to have some humanity. Like, we are gonna mess up, we are gonna fall short, we are gonna have lessons that don't sit well, and we have to be able to reflect on those things and move forward. I think that one of the biggest lessons I learned as a teacher is like, I'm in the middle of a lesson that I think is super dope, and the kids are looking at me like, ma'am. And I'm like, okay, let me stop right here. And I have to be able to like become a chameleon and redo the lesson in that moment. And some of my best lessons have come because the kids have looked at me with the side eye, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is not interesting to me. You're losing my attention. And I've had to do something to like shake it up. So I think that's, you know, it's multiple things that need to happen on multiple levels. We need to get families and communities involved, right? We need to elevate the fact that math is happening all the time inside of your family. We need to show students that they're mathematicians and scientists in everyday life. We need to hold teachers accountable around what they're presenting and what their curriculum is. And as leaders, we need to do our own self-inventory. We need to figure out what we're doing inside of our classrooms, inside of our school communities. What are we elevating as a superintendent? And not just hashtag Black Lives Matter, not just hashtag I want to make sure that my Black and brown kids are doing well in math. Like, what are you doing practically? What steps are you actually taking to make sure that this happens, right? And then what is a follow-up? And I think that that's one of the problems. Like, we're in a performative, some people are trying to do this work, but then some people are like, this is what's happening right now. So I'm gonna wear the t-shirt. I'm gonna say Black Lives Matter. I'm gonna say that I'm decolonizing. Everyone wants to say, I'm decolonizing my curriculum. What does decolonizing my curriculum mean? Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. And so we are at the like 2.5 minute mark. I just got notes that we need to sort of bring it together, and I can't believe this, but I want to add in this perspective from an article that Rihanna co-authored with some really amazing colleagues from other universities. There is this passage here that you all wrote, and it says, and I quote, "There has been a long-standing yet falsifiable notion that Black students are not competent enough in STEM subjects, and that the lack of representation in STEM fields is a result of their own disengagement." And then it says that the authors, including you, Rihanna, you call this matter a deflection. And it's a deflection away. It's a way of blaming folks for what they can't do, but we know they can do. It's a way of taking deflection and saying, I'm deflecting my responsibility onto kids, as opposed to understanding the responsibilities that we should have as adults to actually nurture and care for and provide opportunities for all kids, and especially our kids, to be successful, because they are. And I wanted to put that out there as well, because I think that the work that you do, the work that Carrie is doing, the work that you're doing also, Michelle, it is about questioning these larger assumptions. And really, if we're going to be honest, the assumptions are not just assumptions. They're these racist narratives about what our kids cannot do. And somehow we've got to figure out how to push back, how to say, if you are a district leader, if you are a teacher, a building rep, an educational professional, I don't care what you are, if you are in education, you have to have a commitment to understanding that liberation for our kids and for ourselves and our communities needs to be at the top of all of our agendas. And if we do not care, we should not be in classrooms and we should not be working in education. And so I want to put that out there because I heard Carrie, I heard Michelle and Rihanna, I hear you as well. And in the 45 seconds that I have left, I want to offer you all back what I think I've heard when just sitting here listening to you. And I know I am not a mathematics or a science educator, I'm a literacy person. So bear with me. I'm going to bring it to an end by sharing what I think is a found poem that I heard from you all. And so it goes something like this. Knowing our histories, students understanding math concepts and principles, creating multiple entry points, adults getting out of the way. What do teachers need to know and do? Not killing parts of our spirits. It's right to be in relation. Science, I am teaching. Science, I am living. I am authoring science, youth and maker spaces, giving space to our kids. Disruption, agitation, math is not lying. Math is not lying to you. It's abolitionist work. Decolonize our minds. Content that does not stick is not content that's taught. Having radical conversations. Why certain people have the luxury to think and to be mathematically inclined, and we assume others don't. Social justice mathematics, science as disruptive. Science is disruption. My mom is a mathematician, mathematical genius. I want to offer those words to you, and I want to say thank you for all that you have done, all that you offered to this conversation, and it is my hope that our paths will continue to intersect. Michelle, you are a brilliant educator, scholar, researcher. Rihanna, you are an amazing human being who is doing phenomenal work. And Carrie, what can I say besides you are about social justice, mathematics, education, and the liberation of people. And because of the three of you, I do believe that our kids will be taken care of. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for attending. And just a reminder, Carrie Coca has a phenomenal reference list. And please check it out in the comments. Thank you.
At this time, we would like to thank you for joining us today. A reminder that we have Student Voice coming up on the 21st. It is at 10:30 in the morning, and we would appreciate you attending. The students are absolutely amazing. And Dr. Rocco and I have had a chance to meet all of them. We have Dr. Tyra Good along with Dr. Kinlock. So it promises to be an outstanding session to listen to our students. Thank you again to all of the participants. You were outstanding. And thank you, Dr. Kinlock and the Grable Foundation and the IU3.